will be talking. I'll be talking out of two positions. First of all, I'm a historian, professional historian. At least I try to be a professional historian. He's dealing with the history of 19th, 20th century Eastern Europe and especially Polish-Ukrainian relation. But I didn't just studying history, also practicing history in a way that I was responsible for some attempts of reconciliation. So I'll be talking my personal experience. And this experience is kind of not straightforward because I have on my own record of success and unfortunately failures. So basically, I'll be talking both of the successes and failures because I believe both of them could tell us something very important. But from the very beginning, I believe that war is without doubt is a catastrophe. It's a disaster, and there is nothing that could be equal to this disaster. But at the same time, war provides us with certain opportunity, and one of these opportunities that we started to see some things more clearly that we used to see before. And one of the things is the something which historians know, but now we realize it, that most unfortunately, war is a norm in the global history. Judging by the frequency of the wars in the last several recorded centuries of recorded history, we can tell for sure that peace is something that is rather exceptional, because there is such certain illusion, especially since the fall of communism, that war is already part of the past. The famous metaphor end of history that everybody knows. So basically, the story is that war is unfortunately is a norm, and we experience nowadays with the Russian-Ukrainian norm. There's nothing really surprising that, but that said, there are some very recent developments which give us a kind of a hope. And this recent developments is that we have a new zone, quite a new zone of peace. And this zone emerged relatively recently, since the end of the Second World War. And this zone of peace is more or less coincides with European Union. We may criticize European Union for many defects, and we have rights to do so. But there is one exception that we could not that could really stand. And this is that you could hardly imagine a war nowadays between France and Germany, or Germany and Poland, or any other two member countries of the European Union. And this is quite a new development. Let me just remind you that both the First World War and the Second World War started not in Africa, not in Asia, not in two Americas, but in Western Europe. So when it was started, all this kind of the zone of peace, my claim is that it started since after the Second World War in the one particular region. And this region coincides with all Europe. And probably the starting point is the French-German reconciliation. You may know that basically it's a basic fact that started with the kind of the famous agreement on the steel and the coal between France and Germany, which had some other country, and is believed to be started a cornerstone European Union. But what is more important, that several years later, in the Reims, at the Reims Cathedral, the famous cathedral where the Emperor of France has been coronated for a while, we have this meeting between Charles de Gaulle and Adenauer, and this was during the Mass in 1969, when they reached a hand to each other, and they made the symbolic gest of reconciliation. And this is something which started exactly this concept of reconciliation. I would claim, and this is something for me very important to think, that first of all, this concept emerged recently in the former old Europe, and this reconciliation has a very strong Christian dimension, because the thing is, the atmosphere that happened in the Reims, in the cathedral during the Mass, tells you something which we could see later on recurrently. And the same goes with the next famous reconciliation. Now, at that time, it occurred between the Poland and Germany, and started with the famous letter written by Polish bishops to the German bishops, and this is during the Second Vatican. And basically, this letter has a very symbolic line, which later has been used on many occasions, and we intentionally use it as well. And the line was that we forgive you and ask you for forgiveness. At that time, this letter provided kind of the surprise, not quite favorable reaction from the Polish society, because Poles didn't believe that they have something to ask for forgiveness for Germans, vice versa. But this gest was very important for the future Polish-Ukrainian, Polish-German reconciliation. And the next episode, which is also very known, became a kind of symbolic, is a famous Kniefall von Warschau. When Willy Brandt visited Warsaw in 1917, and he was visiting the former Jewish ghetto, and he knelt in the front of the monument of the victims of the Polish ghetto. So basically what I'm saying, and later on in his memoirs also said this is something very metaphysical in his experience, because he quite often, it was not planned that he's kneeling. He said that quite when he approached the monument, he felt some kind of force behind him, metaphysical force, who pulled him on his knees. And this is something which I believe also kind of this experience, metaphysical experience, which is extremely important for this kind of reconciliation. So this is basically it. This is basically the story. So my claim is, as again and again, that this concept of escalation emerged in the old Europe. It served as a kind of cornerstone for European Union, and still from this territory, it later spread on to other parts of the world. One of the most contested, the most problematic region was exactly our territory, the Polish-Ukrainian borderland, specifically the city of Lviv, region of Galicia, and the neighboring Volhynia. It's a Polish-Ukrainian borderland. And it has been claimed that relations between Poles and Ukrainians on this specific borderlands present probably the longest war in the European history, because it started by the end of the 9th century, like exactly between the Polish and Ukrainian baptism. So basically in 1981, the Kiev Prince Volodymyr went west and took off the Polish cities. And this is believed the starting point of the very long and protected rivalry between Poles and Ukrainians that lasted until the end of the Second World War. So the story is that this war was not just between Ukrainians and Poles, it has a larger dimension, because there are a third part, and the third part was Russian. This is quotation by a famous Russian writer or poet Pushkin, who basically claims that the future of Russia depends on whether Ukraine and Poles could reconcile. If they do, then the Russian Empire is doomed. So this was a kind of a scenario, but through the 19th century, the scenario went in some very negative way. And there are two largest conflicts, two most dramatic and tragic episodes in the Polish-Ukrainian relations in the 19th and 20th century. First, there was a Polish-Ukrainian War, which was around exactly the city of Lviv and neighboring territories. It was a kind of the very paradoxical war, because it started right after the end of the First World War. It was illustration of the famous Churchill word that this is the war of the dwarfs. War of the dwarfs that started after the war of the giants has ended. The war led to some atrocities on both sides, but basically this was Ukrainians that lost this war, and this very much humiliated by this defeat. And this was rather a trauma in their historical memory. And later on, during the Second World War, there was another episode, even much more tragic. This was on Volhynia, neighboring territory. There was a conflict between two clandestine armies, Polish and Ukrainian nationalist armies. And it led to the ethnic cleansing, the mutual ethnic cleansing on both Poles and Ukrainians. There are some attempts, there were some kind of characters of the genocides. And later on in 1947, the Ukrainians who found themselves under Polish communist government has been expelled from their native territories toward the former German parts. And it was basically also regarded as a kind of a genocide. So what I'm saying here, the 19th century brought something quite exceptional, which means in the relations between those worlds, not just war, but the mutual genocide on the larger scale. So basically, it looks like Polish-Ukrainian relations in the Second World War, especially after the war, went into impasse, because the memories of the mutual trauma was so deep that it was very hard to even imagine some kind of reconciliation. But what was good about this Polish-Ukrainian relations, that the miracle really happened. And the miracle started in the city of Paris, on the other side of the European continent. There were several Polish intellectuals who was very critical of the Polish government and their behavior, attitudes toward Ukrainians. And they settled after the war in Paris, and probably the most famous was Jerzy Giedroyc. You see him, he's on this picture. And he founded a journal Kultura. This was the first-class journal. It has the best Polish authors, poets, publicists, political thinkers, writers. Basically, all of them were from Polish diaspora outside the communist Poland. And this is something which is must-read for every educated Polish intellectual, especially younger generation. And in the beginning of the 50s, Giedroyc started intentionally a dialogue what to do with Polish-Ukrainian relation, and specifically with the city of Lviv, where we know. And at the final, by the end of this discussion, Giedroyc came with a kind of brilliant formula. And the formula sounded like, for the sake of Poland, Poles have to accept once and for all that Vilnius is a Lithuanian city and Lviv is a Polish city. It was kind of revolutionary formula. For sure, you could easily imagine that this formula was not accepted. Giedroyc was cursed, ostracized by the Polish diaspora. He was claimed he was considered to be a traitor of a national cause at that time. But what happened, as I said, Giedroyc has immense impact of the younger Polish intellectuals. And since the Poland, even communist Poland, was not quite closed toward the West, as they say, communist Poland was probably the most joyful barrack in the communist camp. So the story is that Kultura, the journal Kultura, found its way to Polish universities and the libraries. And many young Poles, especially those who were born after the war, had access to this journal and started reading it. And it had impact. And probably the most important part of this reading audience was the young intellectuals who later made the backbone of Polish Solidarność, the famous anti-communist movement that '89 came to power. Two leading figures were Jacek Kuroń and Dan Michnik. By the way, both of them had been born in this city. They were of the former communist or socialist background, and Michnik was a Jew, which was also very important. So basically, the story is they were extremely responsive toward historical drama of these people, both Ukrainians, Poles, and Jews, and they worked for reconciliation. And basically, what they did, they turned Giedroyc slogan into the doctrine. Since then, since the Solidarność came to power in '89, they declared a Giedroyc doctrine as a base for the Polish foreign politics toward the East. And the victory of Solidarność and the elections in '89 marked the beginning of the fall of the communism, and the end of the fall was proclamation of independence in 1981. So basically, this happened 2 years after the victory of Solidarność. But the story is something very important, that Ukrainian independence was proclaimed or legislated after the referendum of the 1st of December. And the story goes that at that time, newly elected Polish President Lech Walesa, the former leader, the former worker, the former leader of Solidarność, together with friends Michnik and Kuroń, they stood awake for the whole night, on the night from the 1st toward the 2nd December, listening to the radio to get the results of the Ukrainian referendum. They were sure that Ukraine would vote for independence, and the reason why they staying awake, because they wanted Poland would be the first country that would send their greetings toward Ukraine and recognize Ukraine independence. For them, it's extremely important. This will be Poland. They were afraid that the first country to recognize Ukrainian independence would be Canada, but there is a large Ukrainian community, and still they managed. So therefore, in history, there is a date. If you have a list of the countries who recognize the Ukrainian independence, Poland was the first. And this is intentionally. very intentional, this kind of symbolic feeling. So this is something which I believe is very important. Many people believe, and including me, that this what happened with the Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation by the fall of communism was something like a miracle. Nobody really expected it. And I would say this would be coterminous and probably equal in their importance to the French-German reconciliation. Very much like a French-German reconciliation in the West put a cornerstone to the future European Union. The Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation opened the possibility for spread of this European Union toward the East, including Ukraine. But again, the very important thing is that it was not just about Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation, because both Gedrits and the leaders of Solidarność understood it very well, that there is reconciliation could not happen without Russia. Because if Russia would be remain as a threat toward the Eastern Europe, toward independent Poland, toward Ukraine, this reconciliation would be always in jeopardy. So basically, this was the story, and now everything was very well said, but then came a challenge, and the challenge came to what extent this Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation is really tenable and sustainable. And this came at the beginning of the 0 years, but there were some tensions in Ukraine, there were crises, and this crisis has something to do with the Russian impact. And also at that time, Poland has been accepted in the European Union, and there was a kind of the illusion or fear among many Ukrainian intellectuals and public figures, me included, that this would mean the emergence of a new iron wall between the European Union together with Poland and Ukraine that will stay on the other side of this Union closer to Russia. So in a sense, Ukraine be again isolated. And there is a conflict emerged at the same time. And the conflict was related to the Eaglet Cemetery. The Eaglet Cemetery is the cemetery which was built in the war period in Lviv. And this is the military cemetery that was constructed specifically to celebrate the Polish military honor in the victory over Ukrainians. For most of Ukrainians, it was considered a site of their national humiliation. So you could easily imagine that since when the fall of the communism, since some of the Polish business firm came to Lviv and tried to restore it without the permission of authorities, that would lead immediately to a scandal or a conflict. The story was that the local city authorities banned any restriction on this cemetery, and it could have a tremendous effect on the Polish-Ukrainian relations, because for many Poles, Lviv was very important, and there was a clear signal that local authorities are attacking the idea of the Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation. So there was accusations on both sides, and it was framed. And even the interference of famous public figure politicians like Yushchenko at that time, it was still before the Maidan, it didn't help. So basically the local authority was very stubborn. They didn't give any permission for any kind of restoration, and it all stuck. And then we found ourselves in the impasse. And we felt very much threatened and isolated. Talking we, it was mostly Ukrainian intellectuals, politicians, and public figures. And then at some moment, we came a solution, and the solution worked. And this is exactly when I'm talking about our success. We came with the idea to organize a common prayer on this military of eaglets, the prayer that would be headed by the heads of the two churches, Greek Catholic Church, Uzor, and the Polish Roman Catholic Church, Yaroslav. It was extremely important about this kind of metaphysical dimension. And also very important, we suggested that during this common prayer, one bishop will extend his hand to another and say this kind of the very important words, that we forgive you and ask you for forgiveness. Before this event, we planned a kind of public meeting. You see some of these figures who came from Poland. There are many of them, and everything is very important occurred in the Ukrainian Catholic University. Ukrainian Catholic University was an extremely important place. It was the only place we could do such a thing, because we were not non-government. So we could do whatever we want. And basically it was a common initiative of Polish and Ukrainian public figures. And you see all of them figures, mostly from the Solidarność. You see Kuron here sitting in his famous blue shirt. You see me, who at that time was much younger, Miroslav Marinovich, smiling. And this is kind of very, how to say, sad twist, because Kuron, who at that time came to Lviv, he wasn't visiting Lviv for 50 years since he left the year, but he was already suffering from cancer. And everybody knew that this is his last visit, and he was about to have only several months to live. But basically, this was the story. The story was extremely moving. There was a lot of good words said on both sides, and the spiritual constellation just dominated all the kind of talks. And as a result, there has been a common prayer later on that day, on the 1st of November. The date was chosen deliberately. It was Day All Saints. And in Lviv, there is a kind of habit to attend the cemeteries for that time, and this is exactly what we did. You see the main heroes of this event. This is Cardinal Hrytsak and Cardinal Jaworski told them. You see the many faces. All of them are smiling, and I would say this is probably the biggest event that I ever had in my life. I was so proud that if I would even die on that day, I would see this, I would committed something very important that probably I could give some kind of, this will be counted in the heavens. But the story is, it was a great success. Since then, you could hardly came upon any kind of a strong anti-Polish resentments in Lviv. Doesn't really matter whether it affects the kind of the cemetery affair or just any kind of the things, because basically it says this was a turning event. Turning event in Lviv, and in a sense we closed the several centuries of this Polish-Ukrainian confrontation, and this is something which we really proud of. So this was the success story. This didn't end, because 2 years later, there is anniversary of this events on Volhynia cleansing, let's say Volhynia Reznia. And this is probably the first really historical discussion. Again, as I said, it was on the eve when Poland was about to join European Union. Ukraine was stood on the other side. There was a danger of being isolated, and there was also, very importantly, that there was at that time tensions in Ukrainian-Russian relations. So we felt that we'll be left on our own. So basically, the story is that quite of a sudden, what happened in Volhynia became very important on the public domain. There was hardly a Ukrainian politician or Ukrainian public intellectual who didn't wrote articles, some even books on this Volhynia, and they're discussing what to do with it, how we should reconcile, how we could say play down this trauma in our historical memory of both people. And we tried to repeat our success of the previous years. So we wrote a letter, Ukrainian intellectuals wrote a letter to Polish intellectuals. We used the same formula that we forgive and ask for forgiveness, but it didn't have this kind of effect like we expected, because the Volhynia trauma was much deeper. The trauma about Lviv. There has been official event. Two current presidents, Polish and Ukrainian, once met in one of the village that has a largest numbers of casualties on the Polish side. There was a monument opened there on to memorize these victims, and you see these two presidents giving hands to each other. But there was a very important but. There has been no public there. It was kept extremely official, and the two presidents were served by the militia and police because they didn't want the people to come in, and people were mostly staying outside of this small circle with the banners and flags protesting against this action, because they basically consider that this kind of the act of reconciliation is a big humiliation for local Ukrainian population, which suffer, as they believe, this to the same extent as Polish ones. So basically what I'm saying, this Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation has official, but it's kind of a sham or a fake, because it haven't led to any kind of the larger success story. And What happened later on? You have a change of the power in Ukraine. You have first Maidan, then you have a failure of Maidan, then Yanukovych came to power, and there emerged a spirit or a kind of the ghost of a new union, Polish-Ukrainian Belarusian union, which is kind of counterpart to European community. So actually, this, I believe, the stakes were growing higher. And again, and since the Polish-Ukrainian historical conflict could endanger this kind of the Ukrainian ambition to join the European Union, especially vis-a-vis this kind of the Belarusian-Ukrainian union that was about to come. So basically the story is we started to plan the similar action, this time on Volhynia. This time on Volhynia, we invited the local priests, local bishops. You see many people came from Poland and Lviv. Basically, we're organizing this from Lviv. But the point that the story was that the event was taking part in Volhynia, in the same village which you seen before on the picture. There was a president of Poland, Ukraine, and trying to reconcile with each other. So we try to repeat this action, but nowadays with a kind of public character, and basically, even so, the pictures look very nice. It was a total failure. First of all, the local bishop, and the bishop, it was from Kyiv Patriarchate, Orthodox Church, refused to give a prayer on the Polish cemetery. Intentionally, he said he could pray only on Ukrainian cemetery. This wasn't allowed, and it took us a heart pain to say we was begging him, we're trying to press him, whatever, just to recognize him, to join the prayer that was made by the Polish priest there. But basically, there was a very much of confrontation there, and people not ready to talk to each other. So basically, there were two events, not one event, but two events which went simultaneously, one on the Polish cemetery, another on Ukrainian cemetery. And again, there was a feel of tensions which was in the air. You could feel it between those who were local Ukrainians and those Poles who came from abroad, because again, there was a feeling that both sides were feeling that they suffered more than the other part, so they have to be, so say, especially commemorated. To put this long story short, we have the similar meeting in the local university in Lutsk. You see the picture, you see the same people who were on Lviv meetings, and we try to come with a joint statement, basically with repeating this kind of the words, forgive us and we forgive you, and nothing came out of it, because both Ukrainian and mostly Ukrainian side, local Ukrainian side, they refused stubbornly even to utter the word forgive us, because they say we have nothing to forgive. This is a Polish blame. This is nothing to be accounted for Ukrainians. So basically the story is, so what I'm saying was a total failure. And Volhynia still is very much of the, so say, contested stone, on stepping stone in the Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation. If you want to see Ukrainians and Poles fighting with each other, start talking about Volhynia. You would rather have this kind of effect. And there has been several changes, some ups and downs. There has been change after Maidan. There's a lot of solidarity of Poles with Ukrainians during Maidan. But then again, after Maidan, Poroshenko, at that time president of Ukraine, tried to repeat this kind of knifo. This was by Willy Brandt. He visited Warsaw and he fell on his knees on by the monument of the victims of the Volhynia. But again, this event was unnoticed, now we noticed to say, and the damage has been done. So basically, in the latest year, they came to power the new of elites in Poland, which was basically from peace. This is like I would say mostly very much populist party, which plays with the nationalist slogans very much. So basically, again, they were insisting the truth must be told about Volhynia, and Ukrainians has to ask for their forgiveness, which Ukrainians were not willing to do. And basically, it went to impasse again. And many people believe that this probably will mean the end into Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation. But it was not an end, it was continuation. And this Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation get a new second breath with the beginning of the Polish-Russian War. And you know, there's no need to discuss it in details, how much Poles and Poland helping Ukrainians, especially Ukrainian refugees, how many refugees found a shelter, a rather safe shelter, safe boat in Poland, and Poland is helping any possible way, Ukraine, including with military help. So basically, even so, the Volhynia trauma that is still there, very much there. Nowadays, Poles and Ukrainians at least try to play it down, and they're not talking, they're talking in language reconciliation. So just to put the long story short, I believe to a large extent that Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation has many faults and setbacks, but basically it's done. Generally, it already has happened. Because the main, I would say, criteria that whoever comes to power, either in Kyiv or Warsaw, they will see each other as allies, more specifically against the Russian threat and Russian invasion. So I would say that there is nothing that could be called like an ideal reconciliation. Reconciliation is hardly ideal. There will always be some problems and discussions. But basically, the thing is, and this is probably the main lesson from this Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation, how to reconcile properly, you could not reconcile once and for all. I would refer here to the famous words of Madeleine Albright, who said that reconciling is like riding a bicycle. You have to pedaling all the time. Once you stop pedaling, you fall off the bicycle. So basically say you shouldn't stop reconciling. You could do any kind of efforts, continuing efforts, a small jest of the reconciliation, just to keep this story going. So this is basically the story of the Polish-Ukrainian relation, which I believe is rather positive. The negative, even so I would say again, that we have some setbacks and problems. And judging from my experience, I hate to say it, but I don't believe it in my lifetime. I see possibility of Polish-Ukrainian relation over Volhynia. It will be still there, but there. Probably even our kids will be still fighting with each other about this Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation. Basically it. But basically, as I was saying, this already has happened. So now let me come to perspective of Russian-Ukrainian reconciliation. Is this possible? So first of all, the crucial question is there are Russian gatherings? Because basically, as you remember, the Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation started with this famous statement by Gedrich that for sake of Poland, again, as I'm saying, not for sake for Ukraine, for Lithuania, for sake of Poland, Poland has to admit that Vilnius is a Lithuanian city and Lviv is a Ukrainian city. 2 years ago, there has been a scandal in Poland. They tried to put in the currency a new banknotes, and this banknotes has the symbolically images of the Lithuanian gates in Vilnius and the cemetery of Iglit in Lviv. And they were banned because the ruling elite considered this could be considered by Kyiv as an act of friendly aggression against the historical memories. So this again, I'm saying it's another proof that Polish reconciliation is rather strong and it's there. But basically the story is that we very much hoped with the fall of the communists that we will have some Russian gatherers, someone who would be on the same status, who would be heard by many Russians, who is a trustful Russian, who will say the same word, that for sake of Russia, we have to recognize, Russians has to admit, recognize that Donbass and Crimea is Ukrainian territory. I don't mean to say that this is kind of historical justice and Ukraine and Crimea is a kind of Ukrainian territory for centuries and centuries. It's basically not the case. Very much like in Polish-Ukrainian relation, there is a Polish territory that lands in the Ukrainian, in Ukraine, there is Ukrainian lands in the Poles, but basically the story is in your relations between two countries, two nations, you don't count on historical justice. There's nothing like historical justice, there's no historical borders, just borders. If there will be some kind of historical justice, this principle could be applied that probably Crimea should be given to Greece, because this is the country that has been known, Greece has been the nation that has been known for the first historical record who've been in Crimea. So basically what I'm saying, you not dispute the just character of the borders. There's hardly just historical borders in Europe, but basically you just accept them as they are. This which means they're intangible, because once you touch the borders, you invite a conflict or a war. So this is basically the premise. The premise is that we expect that somebody says that the Russian borders has supposed to be intact, and Russia has to deny any kind of territorial pretensions against Ukraine. The main candidate for such a statement was Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn was a famous Russian writer, anti-communist, half Ukrainian, half Russian. He wrote this famous book on Gulag, in which he praised very much Ukrainian nationalists for their exceptional behavior in the camp. And he used to quote many Ukrainian writers. Basically, he was always saying that both Poles and Russians and Ukrainians, both nations are very close to them. And for sure, Solzhenitsyn is also kind of the orthodox thinker. He was much religious man. So there's something, has all the characteristics we would expect that he would make such a claim. To the contrary, most unfortunately, he made quite a reverse claim. He basically, in his article, written in 1990, a year before the fall of the Soviet Union, he wrote an article, or rather booklet, which is called "Как нам построить Россию," how to build a new Russia, in which he explicitly says that Russia has a territory which extends into neighboring countries, including Ukraine and Kazakhstan. And the most recent developments is Alexei Navalny, the leader of opposition, who has been arrested and jailed, unfortunately. But when it came to Crimea in 2014, annexation of Crimea, he implicitly said that Crimea is supposed to stay a Russian territory. So what I'm saying here, there is we didn't even start this kind of dialogue because we don't have a kind of initial statement made by Russians, very much like Agatha did. Which leads me to another conclusion or other hypothesis, and this I would ask help of my Father Roman and Father Ivan and the theologians, that I believe that very much the Consolation emerged within the framework of the Catholic Church or Western Christianity. It seems to me, again, I may be mistaken, that Eastern Christianity doesn't have this kind of concept of consolation, because this has to be elaborated in theology. I'm not familiar with such a concept in the Orthodox Church. And if this is not there, so how could we reconcile that? And this is again what our experience with the Volhynia taught us, because we tried to invite the Orthodox bishops to tell these words, and basically they didn't accept this kind of the rhetoric, which again brings us to some kind of impasse. So what I'm saying here, that I was without this dimension, very hard to imagine a possibility, opportunity, a perspective of the future Russian-Ukrainian reconciliation. I don't mean that is not impossible. Nothing is impossible. Everything is possible in history, so to say. But it means that we probably have to invest much more efforts in this reconciliation, and probably have to start in dialogue with our Ukrainian church, which is in Ukraine. Just this kind of dialogue, because I believe to many extent, as I used to say, that before Ukraine would ever reconcile with Russia, it has to reconcile with itself, between Ukrainians and Ukrainians. But basically the story is that you couldn't do it just without theological or religious dimension. My experience tells me that if reconciliation is reduced just to secular exchange of formulas or events or gests, like it was with the Polish-Ukrainian president, it doesn't really work. Because you still have a kind of the metaphysical dimension, because basically this must be some kind of bigger meaning. Why we are reconciling for? What is this meaning of reconciliation? Otherwise, we stop in our historical drama. Also, I would say that also very important that there must be some public intellectuals, and especially people who have a trust, because without this, it would be very hard to bring reconciliation. And just to finish, I'll start with the French-German reconciliation. It started in 1951 and then continued throughout the several decades. And this event at the Reims Cathedral took part in the 1962. So basically, it was a long story, very much like a Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation. But is very important, the whole idea of the German-French reconciliation was conceived much earlier in 1943 by Schuman, one of the architects of the future European Union. And basically he said, or he claimed that French could not go like that with an eternal war with Germany, because nobody could wish such a fate for any nation, including French, to have an eternal enemy. And basically said that sooner or later, France has to reconcile with Germany, but on one condition. It could not be done under Hitler. Hitler has to go together with French occupation. In the same way, I would say that there's make no sense to talk with Russians on reconciliation with Putin still there. The entry ticket for reconciliation is that Putin has to go, not just Putin, but his regime. And basically, again, Putin doesn't recognize the language of reconciliation, see reconciliation as a sign of weakness, the words that forgive us, because the only language you understand, the language of the strength, or the force, brutal force, to say. So basically, this is the story, that we couldn't wait for reconciliation that until we see this regime would be defeated. But that said, we have to start thinking about this right now. We have to start the alliance. We have to start to identify the language. If they could not, there's a language, have to teach them this language. But basically, again and again, I would say that without religious dimension, metaphysical dimension, it would hardly be possible. So I would finish at that point, and there'll be some criticism. I will be more than happy to accept it and to respond. Thank you so much.